Hi there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mr. Schwank. Welcome to Cleo's Corner U.S. History. Today, we're going to take a look at one of America's most underappreciated military conflicts. We had bombs bursting in air, totally inept Americans trying to invade Canada, our capital was burned, and the greatest victory of the war coming after the peace was signed. Yet, the War of 1812 is often called the Second Revolution. We engaged in a war with Britain. We didn't quite lose. We could call it a victory, and we launched the nation into a period of economic and physical growth that we call the era of good times. Today on Cleo's Corner, we're going to be investigating how did the War of 1812 significantly impact the growth of the United States. So just to jump right in order to understand why the War of 1812 happened, we first have to understand how Americans were feeling in the early 1800s. University of Virginia historian J.C.A. Stagg, in his book, cites New York journalist Benson Losing in the early 1800s, who wrote that the American Revolution made us free, but not independent, because other nations, especially Britain, did not respect us as a nation, and that the war had finally established the positive and permanent independence of the United States, and that Great Britain learned that the U.S. would no longer, quote, tolerate an insult or suffer its sovereignty to be questioned. So, how was Britain not respecting us? Well, surprise, surprise, Britain and France were fighting again in the Napoleonic Wars, and the British were blockading U.S. trade to France. Additionally, the British, ever in need of sailors for their war, would oftentimes catch a U.S. ship, force their way on board looking for what they considered British deserters, and then take as many U.S. citizens off their ships and impress them or force them to serve on board their ship. What a handy way of getting extra sailors who already know the language. There was very little the Americans could do to stop that impressment from happening. And finally, the British were still sticking it to the Americans by funding and supplying Native Americans in the old Northwest Territory area of Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois so that they could attack American settlers in the area. To further complicate matters, Native Americans specifically were getting more organized again. In previous units, we talked about Chief Little Turtle and the Battle of Fallen Timbers in the time just after the Revolution. And that resulted in natives having to leave the Ohio Territory. Well, one of his younger warrior chiefs, Tecumseh, had never signed the treaty and now had emerged as a powerful leader in northern Indiana, along with his brother Tenskwawata, also known as the Prophet. Tecumseh was uniting local tribes into a large confederacy and had established the large Indian settlement of Prophetstown. They promoted a return to native traditional values, and his message was drawing a large number of Native Americans to the area. At one moment, Tecumseh, when he felt strong enough, confronted the governor of Indiana Territory, the future President William Henry Harrison, at his house in Vincennes, Indiana, saying that if some disputed land was not returned to the natives, then he would ally himself with the British. This obviously would only further convince Americans that the British were meddling in American affairs. In response, William Henry Harrison engaged Tecumseh's warriors while he was away recruiting new Indians. He defeated them and burned Prophetstown to the ground. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., congressmen were blaming the British for impressment and native support. To handle the situation, several prominent leaders especially in the South and the Western states, suggested invading Canada to punish Britain and possibly expand the United States. An opponent to this plan from New England called these lawmakers who supported war, called them war hawks, and the name stuck. Led by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay of Kentucky, Congress declared war on another nation for the first time in history, launching what we call the War of 1812. It was not an extremely popular choice. None of the 39 Federalists in Congress voted for the war. It still remains the closest vote ever taken to declare war, and opponents actually started calling the conflict Mr. Madison's War to express that this was a war of choice, not a war of necessity. In fact, resistance in New England became so extreme to the point that a convention was called in Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss changing how the Constitution works and possibly even secession from the United States. Moving on to the war itself, the major war goal for the Americans was a quick invasion of Canada. If Canada wanted to then join us and join the Union, fantastic, but otherwise, we could use the territory, we could give the territory back to Britain and use it as a bargaining chip to stop the British from supporting natives and impressing sailors. The British are still fighting Napoleon, and they were taken by surprise by the war declaration and honestly did not take it very seriously. They told the Canadians to just defend their territory for now until the war in Europe was finished. The Canadians took their instructions very seriously and mounted a fantastic defense of their homes. Americans, for their part, had never invaded another country. Keep in mind, the only other war we fought was the Revolutionary War, and that was sort of fought day by day. They've never invaded another country, and it really showed. The United States launched 10 separate campaigns to take Canada, and they failed miserably every time with huge losses. Back in Europe, the war came to a really quick end when Napoleon unexpectedly surrendered and abdicated or stepped down from the French throne. This allowed the British to now turn their full attention to this unexpected conflict with their American cousins. And honestly, there was more than a little desire on the part of the British to get some revenge for their loss in the Revolutionary War. So while the British are preparing to fight in America, Tecumseh, who is skirmishing and fighting for the British, was killed in Canada by the Americans in the Battle of Thames. This will have consequences that we'll see in just a moment. But meanwhile, the British had arrived in America and they've set up a blockade of the East Coast, while an invasion force struck at the heart of the United States. They took and burnt our new capital of Washington, D.C. There's a really great story about the sack of Washington that previously, in the lead up to the war, a Washington newspaper had published some scathing articles about one of the British commanders, an Admiral Cockburn. Now, while the sack of Washington was going on, Admiral Cockburn had his soldiers tear down the newspaper building brick by brick and destroy all of the letter C's in the building, smash them up so that the paper could no longer abuse his name. Meanwhile, the newly completed White House had intended to host a dinner party that evening when the British arrived. In the rush to evacuate, the president's wife, Dolly Madison, directed the effort to save various treasures at the White House, including the famous life-size portrait of George Washington, which still hangs in the East Room. There's some disagreement, however, about how this happened. Very likely, she did not ride away with it, carrying it as the myth suggests, but rather left the job to the domestic servants. Nonetheless, she often gets the majority of the credit for it. Several years ago, under the Obama administration, the descendants of the domestic servants who very likely were the ones who actually took it off the wall and rescued it itself were honored for their efforts, and a little bit of equality was given there. Nonetheless, when the British did arrive at the White House, they found that evening's dinner still laid out on the table. So, to add insult to injury, they sit down, they ate the president's dinner at his table, and then for dessert proceeded to burn the White House down. They also burnt the Capitol building where Congress meets, and they completely destroyed the Library of Congress. It was a humiliating defeat for the Americans and truly the low point in a war with not many successes. So the war up to this point is not going well for the United States. If you remember, it was the Warhawks who wanted the war against the protest of the New England Federalists Party. By this point, there was even talk of the New England states breaking away from the U.S. and forming their own nation. Despite the war, they had always maintained friendly relations with the British and were even kind of still trading with the Canadians on the down low. Clearly, that did not make the rest of their U.S. citizens very happy at New England. And it winds up making the next event all that more important to the story. So, as the British continued their advance to Baltimore after sacking Washington, there was very little confidence that the Americans could prevent the taking of another major American city. And if they had taken Baltimore, then it would have opened the way for a invasion of New York and all of the middle states. However, in order for this to happen, the British needed to take the fort that defended the city, Fort McHenry. So they sailed their ships up the Chesapeake Bay, and they began to bombard the fort. After 25 hours of bombardment, all through the night, the British literally had run out of ammunition, and yet the fort had not surrendered. So the British retreated, they sailed back down the Chesapeake, and they headed to New Orleans to try to invade from the south. More on that later. But the Americans had prevailed, and the tide had turned. An American lawyer aboard the British ship during the bombardment took the opportunity to write a poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry that later was set to music and became what we know today as the Star-Spangled Banner. The war was not fought only in Canada and on the East Coast. There were several naval engagements that were fought in the Atlantic and especially on the Great Lakes of Ontario and Erie. You don't really think about having naval battles on lakes, but we did in this case. But most notably, the biggest story that comes out of the War of 1812 is the story of the USS Constitution, which was incidentally one of the original 6 ships of the United States Navy. So she was pretty old. She had served in the First Barbary War, had been decommissioned, but then had been recommissioned specifically for this war. As she is out sailing, she winds up capturing several ships, and in fact, defeats a total of 5 British warships without taking any serious damage. That the cannonballs would just bounce right off of her hull. It earned her the nickname Old Ironside. She still exists today as a naval museum, and she's still capable of sailing. She does every year, goes out into Boston Harbor and turns around and comes right back uh, through the entire history of the United States. So, additionally, conflict with natives was not limited to just Tecumseh and the Northwest. Future President Andrew Jackson was the commander in chief of Southern forces and had spent much of the war beating up on the Creek Indians in Alabama and Mississippi in a separate conflict that we call the Creek War. Nevertheless, he was responsible for defending New Orleans from the British after they retreated from Baltimore. One major issue of being at sea at this time is that without good communication, once a ship was at sea, there was very little chance of finding it and updating its orders. It's a big ocean and ships are pretty small. So there was no way to know, for the British to know, that the treaty ending the war had already been signed before the British attack. The Americans, when the British sail up to New Orleans, the Americans defended the city excellently, although the British attack wasn't very well organized. The battle really only lasted about 30 minutes, but the British lost 2,000 men, while the Americans only lost about 250 dead and wounded, 71 dead. It was the last major engagement of the war, and because shortly after the news reached the Americas that peace had been signed. That's a little bit about Old Ironsides. I had them backwards. So let's talk a moment about the end of the war and the consequences of the War of 1812. First off, Europe is a really busy place at this time. There's a lot of conflict going on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Britain had been fighting France in the years before the War of 1812, and now there were rumors that there was going to be a new war with Prussia and Russia. So the War of 1812 is just a massive distraction to the British, and it's a waste of resources for them. The British are very happy to end it, to be done with it. At this point, no major territory had changed hands. The British hadn't taken anything in America worth keeping, and the Americans hadn't been able to take Canada. So, there's little to lose in finishing the conflict. As far as the Americans are concerned, the British had stopped impressing our sailors and blockading French trade when the Napoleonic Wars ended. Now that there was no war with France, there's no reason to block trade, and there's no reason to take our sailors. And additionally, with the death of Tecumseh and the Creek Indians in the South being defeated, there was little to fear from natives either. So, the real losers of the conflict were the natives east of the Mississippi. The British agreed to end any supplying of the natives, and with Tecumseh's death, that really marks the last best opportunity for natives to mount any kind of organized resistance to American expansion. Within the next 2 decades, all natives east of the Mississippi would be either removed or forced onto reservations. Everyone could claim a little bit of victory. The British didn't lose anything in the conflict. The Canadians could boast that they stood up to an invading army and successfully defended their homes. And the Americans achieved their war goals as well. This is important, as well as suffering enough loss with the sack of Washington and the defense of Baltimore and the victory of New Orleans and the um, Star Spangled Banner and Old Ironsides, uh, that that it was a victory that could unite the nation. Support for the war was extremely divided, but winning it winds up sparking a period of intense national unity that we'll talk about on our next episode called The Era of Good Feelings. The Federalist Party, which had been so dominant, it was Washington's and Adams' party and Hamilton's party, if you remember, had been so dominant up until Jefferson's presidency. They had thrown their support behind New England and the Hartford Convention and opposition to the war, and this now finishes them as a political party. In fact, Federalists and people in New England were practically tripping over each other to show how patriotic and how much they loved America after the conclusion of the war. There's nothing like trading with the enemies, threatening to leave the Union, and saying they don't want to have the war, to sort of make people question whether or not they really are part of the United States. So to wrap up, the War of 1812 is a pretty interesting conflict in American history. It was an offensive war that did not gain any territory. It was a war to stop impressment and native attacks that would have stopped even without a war. And it was a war where all the parties involved were able to declare victory. It was a war that contributed to national unity and sparked the next great leap in American expansion. Thanks for joining us today on Cleo's Corner. We'll see you on our next episode. Have a good one.